All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is James Chatmus, and today we have Ryan Rousseau, continuous delivery architect at Octopus, and he's going to be taking us through today's presentation, which is Octopus 101, branching your deployment process with channels and life cycles. Ryan, how are you doing today?
Doing great, James. Excited to show off two of these features of Octopus. They're some of my favorites. How are you doing?
Doing great, hanging in there. It's a beautiful Wednesday. Awesome. So just a quick couple of housekeeping items. So a recording of this webinar will be emailed to all of you once the presentation is complete. Additionally, we have a webinar channel in our community Slack where you can ask questions live and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. And you can get to our community Slack at octopus.com/Slack. So I'm going to hand it off to Ryan now for the presentation. Ryan.
All right. Thank you, James. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. As James mentioned, this is going to be a webinar that focuses on channels and life cycles. And we're going to show them off with some scenarios on how you can use them to branch your deployment process. And the scenarios, we're going to cover three specific ones that kind of show off that feature and that ability. So we're going to cover what happens if you want to have different projects or different applications that need to go to different groups of environments. Then we'll look at what happens if you need to maintain and deploy different versions or multiple versions of your application. And then finally, we'll talk about how to support special deployment branches like hotfix deployments, beta deployments, and featured branch releases, and how to do that all within a single project of Octopus using channels and lifecycles. And then we'll bring it back and we'll have a Q&A before we end. All right, so let's jump into some of these scenarios and discuss them. The first one is, what happens if you have applications, two different applications, two or more that go to different environment groups? And my examples, I'm using some of our Octopus sample projects, Octopet Shop and OctoFX. The first one, Octopet Shop, goes to three environments. My favorite three, my standard demo ones, development, test, and production. And that's a pretty good standard set, but sometimes you have extra environments. You've got staging, pre-prod, maybe a disaster recovery that doesn't apply to all of your projects, especially if you have different teams or if you have applications that are maybe internal applications versus external that customers or users get to see. So, and that's the case with OctoFX. So it's got the development, test, and production. And in this case, test is probably like a QA, an internal testing, maybe automated testing. And we want to add in a UAT environment, so a user acceptance test. This is going to be a deployment that business users can see or end users can see and test and make sure that the requirements fulfill their needs. So let's jump out of the slides and head over to the Octopus dashboard. Now, I'm going to be showing a lot of Octopus here. And if you're not very familiar with Octopus, we have a Getting Started webinar next Wednesday that will really show you the capabilities of Octopus and how to set it up from scratch. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details of how Octopus works from the ground up. So just kind of hang in there with me if you're new to this and check out that webinar next week if you want to see some more information about that. But on the dashboard, you can see I've got the two projects that we mentioned, Octopet Shop and OctoFX. And right now, they're deploying to the same group of environments, development, test, and production. And we can see the current versions that have been released in each of those environments for each of those projects. So I want to add in a UAT environment to OctoFX. So the first step that I want to do is go to our infrastructure screen. I'm going to go to environments, and I'm going to click add environment, and I'm going to add UAT, user acceptance testing, click save. And if we head back to the dashboard, we're going to see that it's actually been added to both projects and has been added to the end of the process, at the end of the deployment flow. And this happens because of what is called the default lifecycle in Octopus. In Octopus, a lifecycle is really the deployment flow. It's analogous to like a pipeline in other tools. Some tools use that word pipeline that kind of describes the flow of your application, your deployment from one environment to another. And with Octopus, when you're setting up a trial or proof of concept, or you're just setting up for the first time, to get you started and going quickly, you have a default lifecycle that has a convention of, we're just going to let you deploy to the environments you add in the order that you've added them to that screen. So you don't have to go in and set up your first lifecycle or pipeline directly as part of your setup. So that's great for getting started, but eventually you will grow all that and you'll want to go in and add some custom life cycles or change the default life cycle so that you don't have this situation where every environment you add gets automatically added to other projects. Now we can fix this with two ways. Mainly, we're going to do this by updating the default life cycle, but first I want to show just another way to do that, which is we can reorder. So if we've added this UAT to the end of the list, and we actually want it to be in all projects, we could come to the environment screen and click the reorder button. And we can move it up in between test and production. If we save that and we go to the dashboard now, you'll see this moved into the correct place. It's now between test and production, which is good for OctoFX. That's where we want it. But for OctoPetShop, we don't need this environment at all. We want to remove it. So to get to your lifecycle definitions, we'll go to the library section, and there's a lifecycles menu item. And you can see the default lifecycle, and it's got a nice preview of the flow your application is going to take. And these are called phases. So there's a development phase, a test phase, UAT, and production. And all of those phases contain one environment. Phases would be analogous to a stage. So if you're used to hearing like pipeline and stage, lifecycle and phase are kind of similar terminology. So if we click into this default lifecycle, you can see there's some settings. We can give it a name, set some retention policies. What we want to focus on is the phases. And you can see we don't have any custom phases set up, and we actually get a nice paragraph that explains basically what I just went through, how the default conventions for the default lifecycle works if you don't add any phases. It's going to be defined in the order that the environments are on the environments page. I'm going to go in and I'm going to add my first phase, and this is going to be the default lifecycle for all projects. So I just want to go development, test, and production, and we'll handle UAT after that. So I'm going to name this phase development, and I'm going to add the development environment to it. Now, it's not a requirement for the development for the phase and the environments to have the same name. It's a good practice, especially if you only have one environment in each one. It kind of makes it easy to match them up, but it's by no means a requirement. I'm going to add the second phase, which is going to be our test phase. Go in and add that test environment. You see there's some other options that you can set, and we're actually going to set those in our second lifecycle that we set up, discuss those. Production. And we'll set up a production phase. Now, if we scroll down, you can see it gives us a preview of that lifecycle at the bottom of the page. We're going to go from development to test to production. And because they are named the same, that's why it's kind of a single line all the way down. If I was to change that name, you could actually see the phase is this top level, and branches underneath it are environments contained in that phase. So if there's ever a point where the names don't match, they will be displayed as a branch underneath the phase. But if you name them the same, you get this nice shorthand of what the lifecycle preview can be. All right, so we have altered our default lifecycle. We can see that it now is specifically explicit, set to development, test, and production instead of using the default conventions. If we head back to our dashboard, you'll see UAT has been removed from both of our projects. So good, we removed it from OctoPetShop. So now we want to get UAT added back to OctoFX. We're going to head back to our life cycles, and we're going to add a new life cycle. This one we'll name it UAT included because it's going to be the same as the default, but we'll add UAT into it. And you see you can even add a non-default lifecycle that uses those default conventions if you don't add any phases, but we want to be explicit here, and we're going to add in some phases. It's going to be pretty similar to the default one. We'll add development, We'll add our development environment. We'll add a test phase. And here we've got a decision to make, because I can add the test environment. And I can also go in and add the UAT environment to this test phase. It's also a test environment, so it does make sense for it to be in the test phase. And the decision really comes down to, how do you want to force the progression? Do you want to require a successful deployment to the test environment before you can promote it from test to UAT? Maybe. That's a perfectly valid thing to require. But in this case, for the demo, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to say, you know what, UAT and test are both in the test phase. I just want to be able to deploy to both of them together instead of requiring going from test to UAT. So I'm going to add both environments to my test phase. And let's talk about the require to progress option here. By default, it's set to almost complete. Because I've got two environments now in this phase, this means I would have to be able to have a successful deployment to all environments, test and UAT, before I can promote to the third phase, which would be production. I can also set that to say, hey, require a minimum of one. So I want you to be able to successfully deploy to test or UAT, or both, but a minimum of one before we can move to production. And then you can even say this is optional. I can skip this entire phase completely and go straight from dev to production. It's probably not a good practice. That's probably more likely you would use that in development. Say, you know what, development's optional. Let's skip that and go directly to test. So those are your options that you can use. So I'm going to put test and UAT in the same test phase. And I'm going to set production to be the last phase. And if we scroll down to our lifecycle preview, you'll see that it's modeled kind of similar to what we had before. So development has a development environment. The test phase has two environments, test and UAT. And we've got production as the final phase that only has the production environment. And if we were to change some of these options, like minimum of one, that is represented in the preview. So any one of these environments, or even showing that this phase is completely optional. But I want to mark them as almost complete. We're going to save that. Now we've got a lifecycle that has UAT. We need to attach that to our Octopus project. And we can do that by going to Octopus and clicking on the process screen. So we've got our deployment process that talks about how to deploy our application. On the right side, we've got the lifecycle being used. So it's using the default lifecycle, and any new project that you create, if you don't explicitly set it, it will use the default lifecycle. But we can change that by clicking the change button, and we can go in and choose our new UAT included lifecycle, get the preview, make sure it is what we want, and we can click save. We go back to the dashboard, we'll see Octopus Shop is unchanged. Octopus does have the new UAT environment. If we go to our project overview, we can see that we have this release 3888 that has been deployed to development. And because it's been successfully deployed to development, it can now go to either test or UAT. I guess it could go to both also, but it can't go to production unless deployments to both of these have succeeded. So we'll deploy it to test. While that's deploying, I do need to do a little cleanup. I need to add some targets to the UAT environment. Otherwise, my deployments won't mean very much. So I've got a database runner for database scripts. And because this is just a demo example, I'm going to share this target between test and UAT. And we head back to our dashboard. Test is still running. That should complete any second now. Now, one thing to note is by changing the lifecycle, that does affect existing releases. So you can see I can go back and deploy this previous 3887 release to UAT. And if I was to go in and change the lifecycle back to the default lifecycle, UAT would disappear and I wouldn't be able to deploy these releases to it. So we will deploy this release to UAT. And once that is finished, I will be able to promote that one to production. So just to recap, default lifecycle will be used by all of your projects that you create new as a default unless you set them. The default lifecycle, unless you change it, will set a promotion path that matches your environments on the infrastructure screen in the order those environments are listed, but you can reorder them. And you can change your lifecycles under library lifecycles, change the default lifecycle. You can set some specific phases, and you can even add extra lifecycles that other projects can use. Now that that has been deployed, we can see now that test and UAT have completed, we can promote to production. All right, so that is our first use case. That is, how do you manage projects that have different environment groups, different deployment paths? Our second use case is going to be, how do I deploy multiple versions of my application? In this case, I'm going to go back into Octopus Shop. I've got version 1, which includes 2 web applications and a database. That one has been deployed to production. It's actively being used by customers. My team is working on version 2, which is adding a 3rd web application. So 4 assets in total being deployed. Now, when I deploy version 1, I only want to deploy the existing 3 assets. But when I deploy version 2, I want to deploy all 4. And to add a little extra twist to this, I want the packages for each version to be deployed together. I don't want to be able to mix and match them. So when I deploy version 1, I shouldn't be able to deploy any version 2 packages. When I deploy version 2, vice versa, I don't want to deploy any version 1 packages. So let's look at how we can accomplish that with channels and lifecycles. So let's go into Octopus Shop and look at our deployment process. So we can see we've got 3 steps here. I need to add in our 4th step for version 2. So let me clone this quickly. Our new web application that version 2 introduces is going to be our shopping cart API. We can set the role and the package correctly to the shopping cart package. Save. All right, now on our process screen. So we've got our 4 steps. And again, if you're new to Octopus, if this is your first time seeing that, your process in your project is the instructions for how to deploy your application. So you have steps that will have the logic, the scripts for doing the deployments, but it will also have a listing of what the package is. And a package is going to be something like a zip file, a NuGet package, a RAR file or jar file that contains your application assets and configuration. And it's going to deploy those to machines in your environments that match a certain tag. So you can see here, we've got a database package, product service, shopping cart, and web. So if I go to create a release, we're going to see a few things, which is it's pulling in all 4 packages. So it's pulling in, each of these packages will be combined into a release. I have to choose one for the 4th one. So even if I wanted to go in and say I only want to deploy version 1, I'm still having to choose a package version for the shopping cart service, which is stuck on version 2. There is no version 1 for that package because it's new. It's new to version 2. But also, I can mix and match. I can do a release of some version 1 packages with version 2, and that is also not ideal. So we can fix this by going into our channels. Now, like Octopus has a default lifecycle, each project has a default channel that is used for releases. And if you haven't looked into this feature yet, you may not even be very aware of it, because if you only have the one default channel, there's not really exposed to you in a lot of the options. And we'll see as we add some more channels where they pop up in the UI. So we're going to click into the default channel, and I'm going to rename this from default to version 1. Now, the name default isn't what makes it the default. That's actually, this is default channel here. So we could uncheck that to make it not the default. You could make other channels and make those the default later. But for now, we're going to rename it to version 1. And one thing I'd like to point out here is a lot of times there's some help text underneath certain fields on screens that actually give you some good tips about how they could be used. So in this case, there's some example names like 1.x normal and 2.x beta. That gives you some ideas about how you can use channels for normal releases versus beta releases, or version 1 versus version 2. So I'm doing a version 1 channel name. I can choose the lifecycle, which this will come in handy a little bit later. But by default, that will be inherited from what's chosen on the process screen. And the next thing on the list is version rules. So here I can actually say, hey, for these packages, I want you to limit what versions can be selected. So if I click add version rule, I can choose the packages that this is going to apply to. It can apply to just one, or in my case, for version 1, I wanted it to apply to the 3 packages that we're deploying: the database, the product, and the main site. And I can type the version range descriptor directly in this box, but I almost always click on design rule because it's just a handy tool. It's got examples of what those version range syntax is supposed to be. It's got links to the semantic versioning information and our documentation on how to use the range and the tags. So a lot of details here on how to actually use it, but it's actually got an engine that will tell me if my range matches. Because I don't have a range, every version listed here matches. But what I want to do is set inclusive. I want to say, hey, anything from 1.0.0 to 2.0.0, and that's going to be exclusive. So don't include 2.0.0. We can change this one here to match. So you can see, okay, this rule, when it's in place, it will allow packages with 1.x.y, but it won't include anything that's 2.0. And likewise, because that is a 1 on the beginning, if we had any lower versions listed, those would also not be included. So I'm going to click OK. That's all we really need there. So for these 3 packages, I want them to fall within this version range. Save that, head back to our channels, and we're going to add a second channel. This is going to be our version 2 channel. Everything's going to be the default, and we're going to add a version rule for all 4 packages because we do want to deploy all 4 of those with our application. And the version range is going to be very similar. It's just going to be incremented by 1. We want to go from 2.0 and not include anything 3.0 or higher. All right, that should work, and we can save that. Now, let's show a few places where channels will pop up. And you can still see version 1 is marked as the default, so it's going to have this default chip letting us know that. So one place you can set or see a channel is you can click into a step, and if we scroll to the bottom, you'll see it in the conditions now. So because I have more than one channel, I can limit the step to only run for certain channels. I could say, hey, this only runs from version 1, but the correct choice for this one is version 2. And if we look at our process after making that choice, we'll see it's got a version 2 chip listed here. So this is saying this step only runs. Step number 3 only runs for version 2. So what does that mean? That means 1, 2, and 4 will run for all channels right now, version 1 and version 2. Step 3 will only run for version 2. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 will run for version 2. 1, 2, and 4 will run for version 1. That is what we want. The other place this shows up is when we go to create a release. Now, because version 1 is our default channel, it will be selected as the channel for this release. And what we'll actually see here is because that 3rd step doesn't apply to this channel, the package isn't even available for us to select, so it's missing. And what you'll also see is our defaults now are version 1 release versions or release numbers. And if we go into select version, we don't even get the option by default to see version 2 releases. our version 2 packages. If we deselect only for this channel, we can see there are some other packages that exist, but we get a notification it doesn't satisfy the channel rules, so we can't select it. All right. The other thing we can do is once we change the channel, so we change this to a version 2 release, you'll see that it dynamically updates the package list. It has it's pulled in that 4th package, and it's limited us to the version 2 rules. So this is great. We can maintain our version 1 of our application and our version 2. So if I save this release and I go ahead and deploy that to development, we can look at another place channel show up, which is on your project overview. Now, if we head to the dashboard just quickly, you'll see that it doesn't break it out by channel because the dashboard is a very high-level view of all your projects. But within that project overview, you do get a breakdown of the channels. You can see your version 1 releases and where they are in the lifecycle, and you can see your version 2 releases and how they're progressing. So that is one of the most common use cases for channels. The thing to notice here is I'm still able to go, because we didn't change the default lifecycle or the lifecycle used by that channel, I can still deploy version 1 to test and production. And maybe we don't want that. Maybe version 2 isn't complete yet. Maybe we want to stop it at development, or maybe we want to stop it at test and not let it go to production. And then eventually you can change that. Maybe version 1 gets retired, version 2 takes over. You can make version 2 your default channel, change the lifecycle to let it go to production. But we're not going to change that right now. We're going to leave that and go back to the last scenario, which will show off how do we change this to allow a different lifecycle or pipeline for different channels. All right, so our third and final one, I want to support hotfix, beta, feature branch releases. So very, very common scenarios. You do a release, you have a bug in production, user reports it, it's keeping them from doing some work. So it's a critical bug. We need it to go to production as soon as it's finished. So in this case, maybe we want to skip the development environment. We want to deploy directly to UAT. And then once we've got the user to confirm that it's not showing up there, it's been fixed, we're going to deploy it to production. Similarly, if you want to do feature branch deployments, like maybe you're working on a new feature for your application, you want to have maybe your build system is creating builds and packages on pull request, or you've got a dedicated feature branch that you want to have a separate build for that's creating packages, and you want those to go to development and test, but maybe no further than that. That is something else you can do. And beta is kind of like a mix. It's a specialized feature branch, right? It's like beta is like, okay, this is what's about to be released, but we want to stop it before we don't want to accidentally release a beta chunk of deployment code to production. So how do we solve this scenario? And really comes into combining the answers to those first 2 scenarios. So we're going to do custom lifecycles, and we're going to do custom channels. So we're going to go to our library and we're going to create a couple of lifecycles. We'll create a feature lifecycle and we'll add a few phases. So we're going to have a development phase and add that development environment. We'll add a test phase because we probably should still test, especially if you got automated test hooked up. You do want to deploy to development and test for feature branches. We'll save that. We'll create one more. And this will be our hotfix branch. And this is going to be the opposite. We want to skip dev and test and go to UAT directly. Now, again, these are just example flows, like because this is a flexible system and you can really set up the environments that match your project and your use case. This can be as many or as few environments as you want. But for our case today, we're going to go to UAT and production. And we're going to save those. And we're going to go check in on our friend Octopus. Now we've just got a standard release pipeline here, just normal releases, no channels yet. but we are going to go in and we're going to add a new channel. And this is going to be our feature channel. And the key here is we're going to change the lifecycle. It's going to use the feature lifecycle. And we do want to add a version rule because we don't want normal packages or other packages to come through this flow. We want the pre-release tag. So we don't really care what version it has, like as far as 1.2.3, but we do want to use a pre-release tag. So this would be the tag that's on the end of your version number using semantic versioning, something like 1.2.3 dash features SSO or dash hotfix. So in this case, we're going to say feature, and it's a regular expression. So we can say, hey, anything that matches feature and then has something after it. That is going to be the rule that we have for our feature channel. And while we're here, we will go ahead and create our hotfix channel, which will use the custom hotfix lifecycle. And the same thing, we're going to go in and set both of our packages. We can set the version range if we want to match our current production version range, but the main thing here is, hey, we're looking for things that were built from a hotfix branch or through a hotfix build process that has been tagged specifically as a hotfix. And we'll save that. And one thing you'd probably want to do to exclude these from being used in your main, your default channel, is to go and set the version rule to not accept anything. No, I'm sorry, I put that in the wrong place. Into the pre-release tag, we don't know pre-release tags in our main deployment path. So we can see here that it will only allow packages that match a specific version number, no pre-release tags. This means that your feature packages won't accidentally end up in your main deployment flow, and your hotfixes won't get pulled in there either. And because that is a regex, you can be more specific if you want to say specifically only deny features, but everything else is fine. That's really up to you and your team to decide. But now we can go into create a release. And like we could with the previous one, we could change the channel. If we choose a feature channel, it's going to grab our SSO package, which has some feature branch development. We can save that and deploy to development. And we can go back and say, hey, we've got that hotfix ready. We want to push it out to UAT. You can see that it's come in and it's selected our hotfix packages just like we have told it to. And we're going to deploy that. And you can see it's going to UAT. And you can even see on the release that it's going to go to UAT and then production. It's specific to those life cycles, those phases of that life cycle. Cool. While those are deploying, if we come back to the overview screen, we'll now see we've got our default channel, which is our normal releases. We have our feature channel, which is going to have our feature branches. So anything that matches feature something and the pre-release tag is going to go to development, and then we can promote to test. And then hotfix is going to have our hotfixes going to UAT and production. So that is how you combine those two pieces. We could take this same logic and go back to our version 2 of Octo Pet Shop and say, hey, we want to create a custom lifecycle that only goes up to test or only goes up to UAT. In case we actually have one, we have features. So we could have Octo Pet Shop use the feature lifecycle for version 2, and those version 2 releases wouldn't get to production until we're ready for them to. All right, so that was the last scenario we're going to cover today. James, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we had one that came in, and I believe you briefly touched on it towards the beginning, but if, say you have a channel with a version rule, and none of the packages currently in your library match that rule, what happens in that scenario?
All right, so if we go to create a release and say there wasn't a package that matches, will we choose hotfix? And it's looking specifically for like a hotfix package. What happens if it doesn't match? You wouldn't be able to, if it doesn't have a package, you wouldn't be able to select one. Like if you click save, it'll give you a warning. There is a setting you can use to override that so that you can actually break the version rule. It is something you have to opt into because obviously the version rules are there to keep you from doing that.
Right.
But by default, it will give you an error and you won't actually be able to create a release if a package doesn't match that rule.
Perfect. That makes sense. Awesome. And that was it for questions today.
It looks like we may have another question coming in on the Zoom one.
All right.
Yeah, if you got questions, we've got a few minutes we can go over if you want to send them in now before we exit for the day.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I really like channels and life cycles. I feel like maybe they're a little, because the defaults are good. Like when you're setting up a proof of concept, you're setting up Octopus for the first time, you don't really have to deal with channels and you don't have to deal with the life cycles. I feel like they don't get a lot of recognition and they're really, really powerful. They're so useful for these scenarios and even more. Another one that we didn't show today that comes up is, if you have, say you have a bunch of steps related to database deployments and web deployments and service deployments in one project, you could have a database only channel to where if you're like, oh, well, this release is only really data changes or schema changes, you could have a database only channel that will only deploy those steps. So you don't have to go in and click exclude on, 10, 12 steps.
Right. Makes it super handy for deploying just specific pieces of your application. All right. So thank you so much for that, Ryan. Very informative. And kind of just to wrap things up, everything will be shared. All the resources used today will be emailed out along with the recording of the webinar, sometime in the next 48 hours. In the meantime, feel free to check out our documentation and YouTube channel, which are both amazing resources for basically everything Octopus Deploy. And if you do have any other questions that weren't answered or that come up after this webinar, feel free to reach out to our email address, advice@octopus.com, or hop in our community Slack. All of us kind of hang out in there throughout the day and always open to answering any questions you have. Just a real quick heads up, we have a couple of awesome webinars coming up, both hosted by Derek Campbell. Next Wednesday is our Octopus 101 Getting Started webinar. That's on the 28th. And then in the beginning of September, we have an Octo 101 webinar, which is going to be turbocharging Octopus with Atlassian Bamboo. And both those are going to be stellar presentations. Thank you, Ryan, for this awesome presentation, and thank you for everyone that attended.
Yeah, thanks, James. Thanks, everybody, for attending. We'll see you next time.